We are really very privileged and deeply pleased to be able to host again, unfortunately more briefly than in the past, Lina Khatib, who is was the founding director and program leader of our Arab Reform program here at CDDRL. She then went on to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where for a time she headed their program. And she is now a senior research associate with the Arab Reform Initiative, which is a very important network to advance the same ideas and goals that we've been working on here at the Arab Reform and Democratization program. Lina, as many of you may know, is from Lebanon, is deeply knowledgeable about the region. She's an authority on public diplomacy, political communication, and on democratization. She's written extensively on Syria over the past 2 years, especially armed groups like the Islamic State, and has also published 7 books, including one that resulted from one of our projects, one of our major conferences, post-Arab Spring, entitled Taking to the Streets, the Transformation of Arab Activism. This was an edited collection with the colleague from then Yale University with whom we worked on the conference, Ellen Lust, that was published by Johns Hopkins University Press last year. Lina is also a research associate with the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Before I give the microphone to Lina so that we can hear her speak about the subject of the day, Syria Today and Syria Tomorrow, Politics, Security, and Society, I do want to make the following final observation. Lina is the first person that I knew to, in my mind, grasp the full and profound significance of the uprising in Syria and what it would mean if there was not a focused effort to support the aspiration of the Syrian people to end the tyranny of Bashar al-Assad and the Assad family, what it would mean for Syria and for the region. And I don't know of any scholar, I don't know, it isn't to say there isn't one, but I think I know a little bit about the scholarship of and on the region. And I don't know of a scholar from the region, not from Syria, who wrote and spoke with greater conviction and more focused analytic attention at an early point on the urgency of the Syrian civil war and the moral and geopolitical imperative of the West to act and the United States to act in ways that we did not, with the tragic consequences I think we've seen, than Lina. And I would just say I was privileged to be solicited by her to join with her in an op-ed that we published 2.5 years ago, calling for a more serious action, which I'll let her speak about if she wants to address it, by the West to support the resistance of moderate Syrians against the Assad regime. I think her geopolitical analysis and her moral voice in this conflict since early on has been distinctive and admirable. And with that, I give the microphone to Lina.
Thank you so much. Well, I really cannot express what a pleasure it is to be back at Stanford. I mean, I spent 4 very, very nice, lovely, wonderful years at CDDRL. Larry was my boss, and I always say to people, how often do you work with someone for 4 years quite closely and not have a single argument? and and this hasn't changed. You know, he still holds the record for nicest boss in the world, I think. And Stanford was a very good home for me. It was really a very special time to be working on a research program that was dedicated to issues of reform and democracy in the Arab world. We really couldn't do enough. I mean, there was so much going on, and I'm very happy that the program is in good hands right now. Hisham Salam runs it, and it's just going very well, and I want to thank you all for hosting me today. It's just really, really lovely to be back. On a less happy note, Syria. This is what I've been dedicating most of my time to over the past 2 years. I, in a way, had no choice. Let's put it this way. The conflict was just too important. Yes, other things were happening in the region, but Syria, the conflict there is at the heart of so many other issues, not just in the region now, but as you can see, globally. And it is very unfortunate, to be honest, for someone like me who's an analyst and who has a lot of contacts on the ground and who has been observing certain patterns and trying to inform both the public and governments about what is going on, that this has not been met with any significant policy or strategy regarding the Syrian conflict and ending it. And so here we are today. The narrative that is governing conversations about the Syrian conflict are mainly through the security framework. As you know, there was an attack in Paris not long ago. It was the biggest incident of its kind that Paris had witnessed, with deaths that hadn't, been topped since the Second World War. So this is a big deal for Europe. ISIS now, obviously, the Islamic group known as the Islamic State, is seen as the main enemy in this conflict. And now, as you can see, the reaction of the French government has been to attack Raqqa, which is the stronghold of the Islamic State organization in Syria. This is a bit similar to how Jordan reacted when the Jordanian pilot Muazzez al-Kasasbeh was kidnapped and then assassinated by ISIS earlier this year. The same kind of reaction that we're seeing again and again, which is military retaliation to ISIS, trying to solve the ISIS problem through airstrikes and military attacks more widely. Now, I've spent a lot of time over the past 2 years studying ISIS quite closely, including doing fieldwork on the Syrian-Turkish border, and doing lots and lots of interviews in the field and tracking very closely through contacts inside ISIS territory regarding what is going on in Syria and with this group in particular. And one thing is clear. The military approach to trying to solve the ISIS problem is the wrong approach. It's simply not enough. I'm not saying military action should stop. I'm just saying on its own, it's not going to achieve much. People keep asking now, how do we eradicate ISIS? How do we get rid of this monster? And I always say, you need to go back to the root cause. You see, it's much easier for any entity, any government, to send Air Force planes to bomb. This is very easy. What's more difficult is finding a political settlement to the Syrian conflict. And the root cause behind the existence of ISIS is the Syrian conflict. So ISIS really is not the problem, it's the symptom of the problem. And if we think about it from that perspective, then this means we have to just change the way the public debate about what happened in Paris should happen. So part of my motivation today is to try to inject some nuance into the debate about what happened in Paris and what's happening in Syria more widely. Now, I don't know how many people have been tracking Syria as closely as I have, but what has also become clear through my research is that the Assad regime has helped with the creation of ISIS and with sustaining ISIS. The regime has been trying from the very beginning to paint itself as the only alternative to Islamist extremism, and saying that it is not crushing an opposition very early on in 2011, before the conflict became a conflict. The regime was saying, no, we are fighting Islamist extremists that are trying to destabilize Syria. In order to validate that narrative, Bashar al-Assad opened the prison doors and let out Al-Qaeda captives, who he had been using actually to put pressure on the Iraqi government back in the day. This was before 2011. And these Al-Qaeda operatives, a lot of them did not even know they were actually working for the Assad regime. They really thought they were just working for Al-Qaeda. But they would be let across the border, they would conduct terrorist activities inside Iraq and go back to Syria, and the regime would, put them in jail every now and then and release them whenever it wanted. And so these people were released from jail. They got together with former Iraqi Ba'athist officers with huge grievances against the Iraqi government, as well as members of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they got together and formed what is now known as the Islamic State. But it didn't end just with that, because the regime thought that ISIS and groups like it would be very convenient tools to crush the moderate opposition in Syria. And so the regime was not just buying oil from ISIS, and actually, in fact, everyone in Syria was buying oil from ISIS, including the opposition, by the way, and that's because ISIS had control over the oil wells. So in a way, a lot of people had no choice. But the regime, crucially, would allow ISIS to progress into areas dominated by the moderate Syrian opposition. So in a way, the regime was using ISIS as the regime thugs, doing the dirty work for the regime so that the Syrian army would not have to do that itself. And therefore, as the conflict in Syria grinds on, it is ISIS that is benefiting. It's a process that is ongoing, as we know. The repercussions are being felt globally, including with the huge issue of the migrants arriving in Europe primarily, in huge numbers. And here I just want to answer a question that I'm sure many of you have, which is how come we've seen, seemingly all of a sudden, a huge hike in the number of Syrians arriving in Europe as migrants? There are two main reasons for this hike in numbers. The first one is despair. A lot of the people arriving in Europe as migrants today are people who are not coming from Syria directly, but coming from Lebanon and Jordan, where basically millions of Syrians had been taking refuge since 2011. And people still try to go to Lebanon and Jordan, but a lot of people have been there for years. People moved because they thought this conflict would be short-term and they would eventually go back home. But now the conflict, is entering its 5th year. There's no end in sight. And if you are someone with a family, you are witnessing your children grow up in an environment with no education prospects for your children. If you are a young, educated person, you are in an environment in which you are not allowed to work. The only way you could make a living is either by working under the table in a menial job, or by perhaps joining a gang or maybe even an extremist group. So these refugees are starting to lose hope, and this despair is what is leading them to risk their lives in order to try to reach Europe. If you think about how many people have drowned in the Mediterranean so far, 3,000, 70% of those are Syrian. If you think about the crisis of refugees in Lebanon, for example, and Jordan, it's really catastrophic. Only 40% of the money pledged internationally for the refugees has actually reached the region, not the refugees, because even if the money reaches the region, corruption, lack of administrative capacity means that, by the time this money gets to the actual people who need it, there is very little left. So the situation is really dire. Social tensions are rising. So in a way, you really cannot blame people for wanting to leave. The second reason why we're seeing this hike in numbers is that actually this is a regime tactic. As I said, the Assad regime has been trying to do different things in order to keep itself afloat in this crisis. One thing I spoke about is crushing the moderate opposition. The second is now, because that has failed, because even though the moderate opposition has not won the war against the regime, they are still there. And so the regime now, also with ISIS growing and other Islamist groups appearing in Syria, the regime has decided that what it wants is its own survival, which means a reduced area of Syria that the regime would govern. And the project launched by the regime under this umbrella is called Useful Syria, Syria al-Mufida in Arabic, which will change the map of Syria, because it means that the regime is only really interested in strongholds, areas with loyalists to the Assad regime, meaning areas in the west, Latakia, Tartus, of course the capital, Damascus. Now here I want to say something which, again, to inject nuance into the conversation. Some people think that these regime strongholds mean that the population in those areas are Alawites with other minorities like the Druze and the Christians. Whereas, the Sunnis would be outside because, the Alawite community is where the regime comes from, and it's a minority ruling a majority Sunni community in Syria. This is a very simplistic and, I will say, erroneous way of looking at the composition of Syrian society. Syrian society is very diverse, and actually a significant proportion of the Sunni community still supports the regime. So Syria that is useful for Bashar al-Assad is the Syria that contains regime loyalists no matter what sectarian background they come from. And this is why anyone who thinks that the new Syria will be an Alawite state and then a Sunni state and then I don't know what is just being very simplistic. It's not going to work like that. Even Iraq, which has, more of a sectarian fault line between the Sunnis and the Shiites, even Iraq is not so neatly divided into purely Shia and purely Sunni areas. So Syria, useful Syria will be an area that has regime loyalists. Because the regime now has lost a lot of capacity, it is in its interest for Syrians to leave Syria so that it has more ability to succeed in governing this reduced area of Syria. So the less people remain, the better. And the more anti-regime people leave, also the better for the regime. So until very recently, the Syrian regime had blocked the renewing of passports for Syrians. It wasn't issuing new ones either. Now, all of a sudden, the regime is renewing passports again and is facilitating the exit of people from conflict zones. And in fact, most of the refugees arriving from Syria in Europe are not escaping ISIS territories. They are actually escaping territories that the regime is attacking, as well as some people who are also leaving from regime areas, as I said, those who, don't want to be in this environment, either out of fear or because they really don't like the regime, and finally they have the opportunity to leave. So this is why focusing just on ISIS as this is a terrorist threat and this is why people are leaving, they're migrating to Europe to hide from this horrible entity is only part of the reality. It's not the full reality. I'm not saying that is not happening. Of course it is. But actually the numbers tell you another story. The other thing that is happening in Syria on the ground at the level of society, which is also important to think about, is Iran's role. Iran, as you know, has been supporting the Assad regime from the very beginning, using a strategy that is very typically Iranian, that Iran has been using in Lebanon and other places, which is mainly to try to cultivate loyalty for Iran on the ground in Syria. Iran is doing this through a Shiaization project, trying to get people to convert to Shiaism inside Syria. Recently, it attempted to engage in population transfers on the border with Lebanon in order to create towns that are purely Shia, to remove the Sunni community from those towns to another place and replace them with Shia so that it would have access to this very strategic location through which it could funnel resources to the areas of useful Syria that I was talking about earlier. So it's about securing strategic, access for resources. But this project has failed because it's very difficult, thankfully, to engage in this kind of project. But this is the kind of Iranian game in Syria. Iran is mainly supporting the Assad regime for its own benefit anyway. The primary reason really is Lebanon, not Syria, because Iran, as you may know, supports the group Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hezbollah gets its weapons through Syria. So Iran does not want regime change in Syria because the Assad regime has been facilitating the access of weapons to Hezbollah, and it is Hezbollah's weapons that keep Hezbollah politically powerful in Lebanon. So if it loses this access, it would lose its political clout. So really, for Iran, this is an existential issue. It is about Iranian regional influence in the Levant. However, to make the situation more complicated, the Assad regime loyalists are not quite comfortable with the Shiaization project because they are actually secular. They are loyal to the regime. They are secular. So again, we shouldn't think that just because a lot of these loyalists are Alawite means, religion is the primary thing driving them. No. They have longer ties with Russia than they do with Iran. In fact, Iran is a newcomer in this issue. The Ba'ath regime of Bashar al-Assad had been for years sending its military officers to do training back in the day Soviet Union, and after that in Russia. A lot of the officers came back having married, Russian women, and so the ties are actually very strong. And Russia's involvement in the Syrian conflict now, with this escalated military campaign with the airstrikes, is more about supporting the Syrian military than about supporting Bashar al-Assad himself. So these secular regime loyalists are not too happy with the Iranian project of trying to create a Shia kind of current inside Syria. Now, Russia, of course, with this airstrike campaign, saw an opportunity, which is the retreat of the West. As Larry was saying from the very beginning, we have not really seen a viable Western strategy for ending the Syrian conflict. This has opened up space not just for Russia, but also for actors from the Gulf to try to, use Syria as a playground to assert themselves politically. But the mistake that Russia did, well, amongst many, is that with this current escalation and involvement in airstrikes, is that it completely underestimated the Syrian opposition. Yes, the Syrian opposition may be weak, but they are there. And they have put up a fight and are engaging in counterattacks against the regime. And so Russia thought that it would engage in a relatively short-term campaign, crush the opposition, and then bring everybody to the negotiating table, having had the upper hand over the West, be able to then impose a solution to the conflict that would be in its own kind of interest. That didn't quite work out, and now Russia is stuck. It is indeed using Iran for ground support, for the airstrikes, but Iran is getting quite nervous because they can see that the regime loyalists really prefer Russia to Iran. So they feel that things are beginning to slip out of their own hands. And that's why today Iran has been very happy to participate in the Vienna talks. For the first time, Iran has been invited to participate in international talks about Syria, whereas Russia is kind of, less anxious so far. But they are anxious, I think, internally because they don't have an exit strategy as far as I can see. As I said, they thought this would be a quick thing, and there's no exit strategy. And the attack that happened on the Russian airplane in Egypt not long ago is an example of how entering this kind of war so recklessly comes with a huge price. And here I will say that actually Russia is not alone in miscalculating. Every single stakeholder in the Syrian conflict miscalculated. The Saudis thought that by supporting certain mainly Islamist but also moderate groups in Syria, they would be able to crush the regime. That didn't work out. The regime thought that by crushing the moderates, the whole uprising would die. That didn't work out. Iran advised the regime to just, use Hezbollah in order to fight this asymmetrical war, in mountainous areas, etc. That didn't work out. Russia thought, it would involve itself in this way. That didn't work out. So nobody has really engaged in this conflict in any way that allowed them to win the conflict militarily. So there is no military way out. And when it comes to ISIS itself, also eradicating it will not happen militarily. Now, as I said, I did a lot of fieldwork on ISIS. And one thing became clear. ISIS is very much intermingled with the local populations in Syria and Iraq. If you're going to eliminate ISIS militarily using the method used in the town of Kobani, which was liberated from ISIS, it's a Kurdish town. The way that town was liberated was through using Kurdish forces known as the Peshmerga, accompanying the international anti-ISIS coalition's airstrikes, so that the people on the ground from the Peshmerga would relay to the aircrafts the location of ISIS fighters, and then the aircraft would come and bomb, and then the Kurdish fighters would take over these areas. That worked, but Kobani was flattened as a result. So try applying the same method to huge areas, like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor and other places that ISIS has controlled. Think about the humanitarian catastrophe that would result in. You would basically be destroying Syria almost completely. And so that's one reason why militarily you're just not going to be able to, eradicate ISIS. It's very much, as I said, intermingled with the population. The other issue is that ISIS leaders are not really in Raqqa, which is the stronghold. Raqqa is more of a symbolic center for ISIS. The leaders are underground. Nobody knows who they are, frankly. People who claim that they do are only dealing with the fake leaders that ISIS has created for the purpose of propaganda, including Baghdadi, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the so-called leader of ISIS. The leaders are somewhere in the desert, underground, between Syria and Iraq. Try hitting them militarily through airstrikes. It's just not going to work. And the other issue is that, and this is something that goes back to the Paris attack, ISIS actually wants military escalation. ISIS benefits from military escalation because its narrative is about fighting apostate aggressors and fighting crusades. That's the narrative that ISIS uses. If you remember the beheading of 2 American hostages that spurred the creation of the anti-ISIS coalition and the military intervention that started through the air strike campaign, this is exactly what ISIS wanted. The more countries are involved in attacking ISIS militarily, the more ISIS can recruit globally, because then this confirms its narrative about defending Islam from, the aggression of these, foreigners. And we have to here remember that ISIS regards anyone who is not ISIS as an apostate or an infidel, and therefore should be killed. So it's very simple. It's not like Al-Qaeda. Believe it or not, there's more nuance with Al-Qaeda than there is with ISIS. ISIS does not have allies. It does not partner with anyone on the ground, and regards everyone outside to be an enemy, basically. So that's why you cannot really eradicate ISIS militarily. That's why all we're seeing now with the French reaction is more, I think, geared to the French community than to actually doing anything meaningful about Syria. We have a government that's desperate, that wants to show its people that it's doing something, to react to this attack. But actually, the trend that we're witnessing, I predict, is going to continue. Just today, we heard that there was a plot in Germany that was foiled. There was also a plot in Tunisia that was foiled. I expect that this is going to be a trend witnessed worldwide. And I personally have been saying this to various governments for quite some time, saying as long as this conflict grinds on, the kinds of attacks that were happening far away are going to come and hit us here, in Europe or whatever. And this is also because the model that ISIS uses, which is similar to the model of Al-Qaeda, is using opportunistic attacks. The idea is to get at the enemy whenever and wherever you can. So you cannot really predict where the next explosion or attack might happen. Anywhere where there are ISIS supporters can witness an attack. This is something that, is just part of their new tactics. And one thing that they said to me in my when I was doing my research, and by the way, I published a very long, detailed paper for the Carnegie Endowment back in June called The Islamic State Strategy, Lasting and Expanding. So if anybody wants to delve into the details of my fieldwork, you can read it there. They said that these attacks outside Syria and outside Iraq have two aims. One is to increase the morale of their supporters worldwide. As I said, they can show that they have global influence. This is attractive, and they need recruits. And when I say they need recruits, it's not just fighters. They also need residents. One thing we have to remember is that the ISIS project is indeed a state project. ISIS is a very sophisticated organization, and it has learned from the experiences of Al-Qaeda, from the Taliban, from Hezbollah, from all kinds of other Islamist groups, terrorist and non-terrorist, by the way. And it has learned best practices, between quotation marks, and also learned from their mistakes. And it has learned that a state project needs perhaps a generation to be viable. And it is working on it. And it is actually counting on the Syrian conflict grinding on while it literally grows its own generation of supporters. And that's why we see so much focus on education by ISIS, trying to, now take over the curriculum and basically engaging in propaganda courses for young people growing up in areas under its control. So, as I said, the first aim of the opportunistic attacks is to increase the morale of people so that it would attract residents who would come and live in ISIS territory and help ISIS build its state project. And you will see every now and then ISIS launches these calls for technocrats to come and help build the Islamic State. And a lot of people, again, this is something that came up in my research. In Tunisia, for example, 3,000 Tunisians have gone to join ISIS. A lot of them, families, not just fighters, go because they think it's this ideal. And a lot of people from Europe, too, think this is, the true Islamic State. The other reason behind the attacks is that while building the state project and sorting out all the problems that ISIS has on the ground in terms of logistics, in terms of governance, this is a state in the making in a way, ISIS needs time, and being kind of attacked in a strategic way does not help it. Whereas being attacked in a kind of reactive, iterative way, as we're seeing right now, actually is helpful. So we have to make a distinction between having a properly thought out Western military campaign against ISIS and the kinds of reactive or sometimes symbolic attacks that we're seeing with the international coalition and now France. So ISIS said that they want to actually distract the West and even, Arab countries that don't like ISIS and other places to focus on their internal security so that ISIS would be left alone to build its state. So there is a strategy to get people to look inwards. And indeed, we are seeing this now in Europe, talking about how to secure Europe, closing borders. I was in New York just a few days ago. The police were everywhere because I was there on Friday when the Paris attack happened. So, unfortunately, it looks to me that so far ISIS is kind of doing okay in terms of its own strategy, whereas, the rest of the world is not doing very well. In fact, the West is playing right into the hands of ISIS. And here I will say that the lack of leadership in the US is making its European allies vulnerable. Because the US is a bit far away, whereas Europe is a lot more accessible, and there are a lot more recruits, that ISIS has managed to get there. And as long as there is no political solution to the conflict in Syria, Europe will remain vulnerable. And the same thing applies to the migrant crisis. Again, people have been asking me, I was speaking at the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum just last week. The big question of the day was the migrant crisis in Europe and what to do about it. And I always say, go back to the root cause. It's all about the Syrian conflict. You try to find a way to end the reason why people are becoming migrants and refugees in the first place. If you don't, you're just going to be trying to put a band-aid on a deep wound. But unfortunately, what we've seen is the opposite. Very recently, the United States has cut the funding to the only moderates who had any chance of creating a viable alternative to the Assad regime in Syria. And here I'm talking about the Southern Front in southern Syria and Daraa. Now, these guys are true moderates. They are part of the Free Syrian Army. they were trying not to just have a military project, but also a political project, as well as a project of governance, linking with local councils in that area, to present a model that would gain gain credibility for the Free Syrian Army. And they were doing well militarily as well. And they got to a stage few months ago that would have, had things continued to go well, allowed them to actually take over Damascus, because Daraa is only 100 kilometers away from Damascus. The United States, meanwhile, was very happily touting its so-called train and equip program, which spent millions of dollars on training new fighters who were carefully vetted, between quotation marks, by the United States.
Million.
Yes, there were only, as Larry just mumbled, 5 such fighters. Why is that? People might think, oh, it's because there are no really good people in Syria, because everybody's an Islamist. No. They were asked to sign forms that said, we would only fight ISIS, not the Assad regime. The people who entered this uprising from the very beginning entered it because they wanted a regime change in Syria and wanted reform and democracy and all that. Yes, they will fight ISIS because ISIS is also fighting them, but they also want the regime to go. And so to say, no, you're not allowed to fight the regime, we will only help you if you're going to fight ISIS, of course they're not going to accept joining this program. The other issue is the lack of understanding regarding the division between moderates and Islamists in Syria. And this is a whole other very complicated issue that I'm not going to go into detail about, but I will briefly say that not everybody who has joined a group that is an extremist Islamist group, and I'm not talking about ISIS here, I'm talking mainly about groups like Jabhat al-Nusra or Ahrar al-Sham. Believe it or not, not everybody who has joined these groups has done so out of ideological conviction. A lot of the reason why, and again this is something that came up in my fieldwork, a lot of the reason why people join such groups is economic and is also political, because when the Free Syrian Army offers people $60 a month, Jabhat al-Nusra comes and offers $300 a month. You're a fighter on the ground, you have a family, what are you going to do? When Jabhat al-Nusra has a lot more military resources than the Free Syrian Army, who are you going to kind of join in order to get your political goal, which is regime change? What happened with the Free Syrian Army, unfortunately, is that although the United States primarily funded this entity to a degree, it never gave it enough support. It never gave it the resources needed to really make a difference on the ground. The support was always just enough to keep the Free Syrian Army alive, but not to allow it to really make a difference. And this is the result now. The result now is that the Free Syrian Army is weak, and then people come and say, oh, but the Syrian Army is not really delivering, so why should we support it? You set something up for failure, and then, you say, oh, but it failed, so, it's not worth supporting anymore. And it's very frustrating to hear about, oh, is there such a thing left as a moderate opposition in Syria? You see, the lack of support, adequate support for the Free Syrian Army is what left the space open for groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, and other Islamist groups to take advantage. As I said, they have funding, mainly from Gulf sources, private donors in the Gulf who fund these entities for their own political goals. It has very little to do with the states in the Gulf, although entities like Qatar also, are involved in supporting some of these groups, and Saudi Arabia supports Ahrar al-Sham. But anyway, what happened is, with the moderates not playing a prominent role, these groups found space for not just playing a military role, but also playing a potentially political role, and they're working on it. And here I'll give you just an example of how observant these groups are, because again, it's not helpful to think about them as just extremist groups. They are also sophisticated. So Jabhat al-Nusra, for example, recognized that Syrians, a lot of them, did not like the regime because the regime was oppressive. But when the regime left, it was replaced with sometimes Free Syrian Army officers who unfortunately became warlords. Why did they become warlords? Well, this is war, but when the United States and other entities gave support to the Free Syrian Army, they did not link the support with good governance clauses, just like what happened with the case of the Iraqi army. So you give a lot of resources, a lot of equipment, technical training to this army, but you ignore the issue of accountability, transparency, justice, fairness. So you had a government in Iraq that was discriminating against a huge proportion of the Iraqi population. So when ISIS was created and it tried to enter Mosul, the Iraqi army didn't put up a fight because the army felt that there is no sense of national belonging that would drive it to, try to face this enemy. And basically, with Syria, you will probably hear this if you follow the situation quite closely, that there were two main groups from the Free Syrian Army that ended up disintegrating and being attacked by Jabhat al-Nusra that took over their weapons, which triggered the classic debate about weapons falling into the wrong hands. Well, perhaps if you had, coupled the aid with measures guaranteeing that these people would not become warlords and become hated by the population under their control, perhaps they would have had a chance of the population actually supporting them when they were attacked by Nusra. But what happened with entities like Jaysh al-Islam is that when when Jabhat al-Nusra attacked this group, the population were happy and they helped Nusra because they said, yeah, you will save us now from corruption. So Nusra also looked at ISIS and saw that although ISIS has a state project and is establishing Islamic courts, partly because ISIS is an international entity with people coming from all over the world, as you know, and it still kind of doesn't have written laws, and the different emirs of ISIS interpret things their own way in different places, so there's no consistency. So if you were living there as a citizen and something happened, and you ended up in court, you had no idea whether you were going to be beheaded or what. I mean, you had no idea. So this sense of inconsistency made people resentful towards ISIS. Jabhat al-Nusra came and established Islamic courts, not, I will say fair courts, but consistent courts. And for people who are exhausted by war, the sense of order that groups like Jabhat al-Nusra brought was relatively attractive. And Jabhat al-Nusra came and said, see, we can deliver on the ground. We can protect you. So the sense of order and protection, very basic human needs, is what allowed these Islamist groups to grow and suddenly become so influential, seemingly suddenly. But it's not sudden. So they are sophisticated and they are trying to appeal to the local population. And now Ahrar Sham, which is another very influential Islamist group in Syria that is, I will say, extremist, but a lot more pragmatic and not linked with Al-Qaeda, is trying to present itself as the entity that would be the most viable actor to lead Syria in a political transition. So it's very sad that Syria today seems to have these Islamist extremist groups trying to steer the process in a way that would put them in power. And when the West does not support the moderates on the ground, this is what happens. And ISIS, meanwhile, is benefiting from, as I said, the lack of a resolution to the conflict because it is feeding on people's grievances. It is feeding on the regime thinking of it as a convenient entity. It is feeding on the West attacking militarily when, the real solution should be elsewhere. And meanwhile, the United States in particular is not leading the kind of international negotiations that should happen in order to lead this conflict to a resolution. And I really believe that it is the US that can play this role and nobody else. Europe can only play a supportive role. So I will end it here. I know there's a lot to take on, but I hope I've injected even a tiny bit of nuance into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.